I knew, 3 days before my college graduation, that my brother would call. I didn't know what the emergency would be. That part changed every time. Once it was a busted pipe flooding his apartment. Once it was a car that wouldn't start, and he had a job interview he absolutely could not miss. Once it was chest pains that turned out to be gas. But the timing was always the same. Something important was about to happen for me, and Mitchell would call, and my parents would go. I'd been watching this pattern since I was 19. By the time I was 22 and stand 2 days out from the biggest morning of my life, cap, gown, the whole thing, I had cataloged enough instances to write a dissertation on the subject. Not that anyone would have believed me. My name is Leonard, and this is the story of how I lost 7 years of my life to a pattern nobody wanted to see. Let me back up. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, the second of 2 boys. My parents, Frank and Miriam, were both school teachers who believed deeply in fairness and doing right by their kids. That's what they told themselves anyway. My father, Frank Alderton, 58 years old at the time this story ends, taught high school history for 31 years. My mother, Miriam Alderton, 56, taught 4th grade. They were good people. I want to say that clearly because what happened between us wasn't the result of cruelty. It was the result of something quieter and in some ways harder to fight. Blindness. Mitchell was 4 years older than me. Mitchell James Alderton. He was the kind of person who filled a room. Loud laugh, good stories, the type who made friends in 10 minutes and enemies never. Or so it seemed. Growing up, I idolized him. He was my big brother. I thought whatever he did was cool. I didn't start noticing the pattern until I was old enough to watch it repeat. The first time, I was 19. I'd gotten a part in a community theater production. Nothing major. A supporting role in a local staging of a play. But it was my first time on any kind of stage, and I'd been rehearsing for 2 months. My parents promised they'd be in the front row. Mitchell called an hour before curtain. His power had gone out, and he needed someone to drive him to a hardware store to buy a generator because he had medication that needed refrigeration. My parents left. They sent me a text that said, "So sorry, sweetheart, we'll make the next one." There was no next one. The run was 3 nights, and they came to none of them. When I brought it up afterward, my mother said, "Mitchell needed us. You know how he is." And there it was. You know how he is. That phrase became the wallpaper of my life. I heard it so many times over the next few years that it stopped sounding like an excuse and started sounding like a weather report. Mitchell is unpredictable. Mitchell has needs.
Mitchell is just Mitchell.
I started keeping a list, not because I'm the type of person who keeps lists. I'm not, generally, but because I needed to know I wasn't imagining it. I wrote things down on the Notes app on my phone. Dates, what the emergency was, what I had lost. My 19th birthday. Parents left my dinner early because Mitchell called saying he'd been in a fender bender and was too shaken to drive. They spent the rest of that evening with him. My 20th birthday. They canceled dinner altogether because Mitchell had called that morning in a panic about a lease dispute with his landlord, and they spent the day making phone calls on his behalf. My 21st, the one that's supposed to matter, the milestone. My parents showed up to the bar where my friends and I were celebrating, stayed for 45 minutes, and left when Mitchell texted that he was having what he described as a breakdown and needed them to come over. I called them the next morning and tried to have a conversation, a real one. I told my father that it felt like Mitchell's problems always came first, always, no matter what was happening for me. I used specific examples. I was calm. I was 21, and I had rehearsed what I wanted to say because I knew if I got emotional they'd dismiss it as me overreacting. My father was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Leonard, your brother struggles in ways you don't. You've always been the strong one. We just need you to understand that." I was the strong one. That's what being reliable got me. Being the kid who didn't need them meant being the kid they didn't show up for. I want to be fair. My parents weren't monsters. They weren't doing this to punish me. They had convinced themselves, genuinely I believe, that Mitchell needed more, that he was fragile in a way I wasn't. And Mitchell, whether consciously or not, had figured out that a phone call at the right moment would pull them toward him and away from whatever I had going on. I don't know if Mitchell did it on purpose. I've turned that question over for years. What I know is that the result was the same, regardless of intent. He got them, and I didn't. By the time my college graduation came around, I was 22 and I had quietly accepted, in the part of myself that had been tallying things up since I was 19, that something would happen. I didn't say this out loud to anyone. I didn't want to seem paranoid. I didn't want to give Mitchell, or the pattern, that kind of power over how I talked about my own life. I was graduating with a degree in civil engineering from Ohio State. I'd done well. Not perfectly, but well. I was the first person in my family to graduate from a 4-year university on that side. My father had a teaching degree from a community college program. My mother the same. This wasn't something they said out loud, but I knew it mattered to them. They'd talked about my graduation since my sophomore year. My mother had already bought her outfit by March. 3 days before the ceremony, Mitchell called. I wasn't on the call, but I found out about it from my mother, who came to tell me that evening with that particular look on her face. The one that meant she was about to ask me to understand something. Mitchell had been evicted. Not suddenly, this had apparently been building for 2 months, but he'd gotten the final notice, and he had nowhere to go, and he needed our parents to help him move his things into storage and find him a place to stay. That weekend, my mother said all of this, and then looked at me the way you look at someone when you already know what you're about to tell them is wrong but you've already decided. "We'll be back by Sunday," she said. "The ceremony is Sunday afternoon, right?" I said yes. The ceremony was at 2 o'clock Sunday afternoon at the Schottenstein Center. I had told them this 7 times since February. It was on the calendar on the refrigerator at their house. I had seen it there with my own eyes at Easter. "So you'll be back," I said. "That's the plan." She said, "I want to tell you that I pushed back harder. That I said what I was actually thinking, which was, this is it. This is the thing. This is the one you don't get to miss." But I didn't. I think part of me didn't want to have the fight, and part of me, the part that had been watching this pattern for 3 years, already knew nothing I said would change what was going to happen. Saturday came and went. I texted my mother twice. She responded both times that things were taking longer than expected. Sunday morning, my graduation day, I got dressed in my apartment. I had a roommate at the time, a guy named Bryce, who had offered to come with me because his family was out of state, and he wasn't walking until December. We ate breakfast together at the IHOP near our apartment, and Bryce didn't ask about my parents, which I was grateful for. At 11 in the morning, I got a text from my father, not a call, a text. It said, "Leonard, we are so sorry we didn't make it back. We're going to watch on the live stream. We are so proud of you. Call us after." I read it twice. Then I put my phone in my jacket pocket, and Bryce and I drove to the Schottenstein Center. I walked across that stage. My name was called. I shook the dean's hand. I accepted my diploma cover. The actual diploma comes in the mail later, a fact I remember thinking was oddly fitting. The way real things always arrive a little after the moment. I did all of it with people around me who had families in the stands, and I had Bryce who cheered loud enough for a whole section. I don't say this for sympathy. I say it because I want you to understand what it cost me to be calm about it for as long as I was. That evening I called my parents. My mother answered, and the first thing she said was, "We watched the whole thing. We saw you walk. We were so proud." I said, "You weren't there." She said she knew and she was sorry, and Mitchell had needed them, and it had just been impossible to get back in time. I asked, "Does Mitchell know when my graduation was?" She paused. Then she said, "Of course he does." I said, "Okay." And then I said, "I need some time." And I hung up. I didn't call them back for 6 weeks. That wasn't a decision I made dramatically. I didn't throw my phone across the room or write anyone a letter. I just didn't pick up the phone. And the days turned into weeks, and I found that the silence was actually easier than I'd expected. That probably should have told me something. When I finally called back, we had a stiff conversation about nothing, how I was settling into my new job, how my father's semester was going. Nobody mentioned the graduation. I think they were relieved I'd called. I think they took that as a sign that things were fine. Things were not fine. For the next 2 years, I did the thing that people in my situation often do. I stayed in the relationship but kept my distance. I showed up for Thanksgiving and Christmas. I called on birthdays. I was present enough to avoid the conversation about why I wasn't fully present. It was exhausting in a low-grade way, like a headache you've had so long. You forget it's there until someone mentions headaches and you think, "Oh, right, that." The thing that finally made me leave, fully, for real, for 7 years, happened when I was 24. I was getting married. Her name was Claire, and she was 30 years old. A pediatric nurse from Columbus who I had met at a work event 2 years earlier, and who had, over the course of those 2 years, become the person I called first when anything happened, good or bad. Claire Ann Whitfield, daughter of Lawrence and Deborah Whitfield, a woman who saw through my careful calm immediately, and once told me, early on, "You've been the reasonable one for so long you've forgotten you're allowed to be hurt." Claire and I got engaged on a Thursday evening in November. Simple, private, the way we both wanted it. Dinner at the Italian place in German Village. where we'd had our first date, a ring I'd spent 4 months picking out, just the two of us. We called our families that same night. My mother cried. My father said he was thrilled. Mitchell said, congroused he'd said to me in months. The wedding was set for the following October. 14 months away. Plenty of time. Claire and I chose a venue, a renovated barn outside of Columbus that held about 120 people. The kind of place with string lights and Claire had fallen in love with the second she walked through the door. We put down a deposit. We sent save the dates in January. We planned the ceremony for 2 in the afternoon on a Saturday. I told my parents the date 18 months in advance. I told Mitchell. I confirmed with my parents again at Christmas. I confirmed again in February. I am telling you about this confirming because I want you to understand that I was not careless. I did not assume. I checked and rechecked because somewhere in my chest was the same animal that had been pacing since I was 19. And it knew. It knew. The week before the wedding, Mitchell called our parents. He had lost his job. Not that week, apparently 2 months before, but he hadn't told anyone, and now he was 2 months behind on rent, and the landlord was threatening to go to collections, and he needed help. Real help, financial help, the kind that required my parents to drive 2 hours to sit with him and go through his paperwork and figure out what could be saved. My mother called me. It was Tuesday. The wedding was Saturday. She said they were going to go help Mitchell Thursday. They'd be back Friday, plenty of time to be there Saturday. I said, Mom, she said, we'll be there, Leonard, I promise. I want to tell you I believed her. I don't think I did fully, but I wanted to. She was my mother. Thursday came. Friday came. Friday afternoon, my father texted me that they were staying one more night, that Mitchell was in rough shape, that they'd be there in the morning. Saturday morning, the morning of my wedding, my father called at 7 a.m. He said, son, I don't think we're going to make it. I was standing in the bathroom of the hotel room where I'd spent the night with my best man, Andrew, and I looked at myself in the mirror for a long moment after he said it. Andrew was asleep in the other room. The ring was on the nightstand. The suit was hanging by the window. Okay, I said. Leonard. Okay, I said again, don't come. I hung up. I didn't cry. I didn't throw anything. I washed my face. I woke Andrew up. I said, my parents aren't coming. And Andrew, who had known me since college and knew the whole history, said, I'm sorry, man. And that was it. We got dressed. We went and got married. Claire knew before the ceremony. She held my face in both hands in the hallway outside the venue and she said, are you okay? And I said, I will be. She didn't push. That's the thing about Claire. She knows when to hold on and when to give a person room to feel something on their own terms. The ceremony was everything we'd wanted. Her parents were there, both of them, seated in the front row with red eyes from the moment she walked in. My side was Andrew and a couple of friends from work and my grandmother on my mother's side, Nana Ruth, who was 81 and had driven herself from Springfield, and who found me before the ceremony and squeezed my hand and said, your parents are idiots, which made me laugh for the first time all day. We took pictures, we danced, we cut the cake. Claire's father gave a toast that made everyone cry. I gave a toast about the kind of person Claire was, specific, true things, the kind that aren't hard to say when you mean them. Mitchell sent a gift, a coffee maker, mid-range. I've thought about that gift many times since. The Monday after we got back from our honeymoon, I sent my parents a letter, actual paper, handwritten. Not because I was trying to be dramatic, but because I didn't trust myself to stay calm on the phone. And I thought they deserved to read what I had to say slowly, more than once if they needed to. I told them about the list I'd been keeping since I was 19. I went through it, item by item. Every event they'd left early, every birthday they'd shortened or canceled, every time Mitchell had called at exactly the right moment and they'd gone. I told them about graduation day, about sitting with Bryce at IHOP while they were wherever they were. I told them about my wedding morning, my father's call at 7 a.m., looking at myself in the bathroom mirror and saying okay because what else was there to say? I didn't call them names. I didn't accuse Mitchell of doing it on purpose, though by then I had my own suspicions. I just said, here is what happened. Here is the record. Here is what it cost me. And I said that I needed space, real space, not the polite distance I'd been keeping for years, and that I would reach out when I was ready. I wasn't ready for 7 years. In those 7 years, I built a life. Claire and I bought a house in a neighborhood in Columbus with a good school district, which mattered because our daughter Maya was born 3 years in. I got promoted twice at work. We got a dog, a ridiculous beagle named Captain, who destroyed 2 pairs of shoes and 1 throw pillow before settling into his personality, which turned out to be deeply gentle. I ran a half marathon at 31 and swore I'd never do it again, and then did it again at 33. I made friends through Claire's work circles and through the neighborhood and through Maya's daycare pickups, the kind of friends who become the people you call when something breaks. A furnace, a marriage, a piece of yourself. My parents called occasionally in the first couple of years. I didn't pick up, they sent cards. I read them and didn't respond. After a while the cards slowed, and then they stopped. I don't know exactly when. There wasn't a last card. I just noticed at some point that there hadn't been one in a while. I heard about Mitchell through Nana Ruth, who called me every few months just to talk and who had the good sense not to make those calls about family drama. She'd mention him the way you mention weather. Mitchell moved to Akron, the same way you'd say it had rained last Tuesday. From Nana Ruth, I learned that Mitchell had gone through 3 jobs, 2 apartments, and eventually some kind of intervention that my parents had organized with a counselor. Whether that helped, I didn't know. I'd stopped being curious about it. What shifted things, in the end, wasn't Mitchell at all. It was Nana Ruth. She called me on a Tuesday in March, 7 years after the wedding. I was putting Maya to bed. She was 4 by then, and at that age bedtime is a negotiation. And I stepped out into the hallway to take the call. Nana Ruth didn't waste time with preamble. She was 88, and she'd long since decided life was too short for it. She said, "I want to tell you something before I'm not here to tell it. Your parents have been carrying this for a long time. Your father cried at Easter. Real crying, the kind that embarrasses a man. Your mother asks about Maya every time I see her. I'm not saying they handled things right. You know I think they handled it badly, but I think you should know they know that. And I think you should decide what you want to do with that information before I'm not around to watch you figure it out." I didn't say anything for a moment. I could hear Maya in her room, reciting something to her stuffed animals. I said, "How is your health, Nana?" She said, "That's not what this call is about." I said, "I know." I talked to Claire about it that night, after Maya was asleep and the house was quiet. Claire listened. She's a good listener, Claire, one of those people who actually lets a sentence end before they start forming a response. When I finished, she said, "What do you want, Leonard? Not what you should want. What do you actually want?" I didn't have a clean answer. I'd spent 7 years not missing them, or telling myself I wasn't, and the truth was more complicated than that. I missed something. Not necessarily the parents I'd had, but the idea of parents who showed up. I missed the version of the story where graduation day had just been graduation day. I called my father 2 weeks later, before Claire and Maya were awake. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and I dialed. He picked up on the second ring. There was a pause, and then he said, "Leonard, just my name." The way he said it, careful, like something he'd been keeping in a drawer for 7 years, and was finally allowed to take out, I had to breathe for a second. We talked for 2 hours. There were parts that were hard to say, and harder to hear. My father didn't make excuses. He said things I hadn't expected him to say, that he'd known, somewhere beneath everything, that what they'd been doing wasn't fair, that he'd told himself Mitchell needed them more, and that what that had really meant was that Mitchell was louder about needing them, and that he'd confused loudness with urgency for too long. He said he'd read my letter many times over the 7 years. He said he was sorry about graduation. He said he was sorry about the wedding. He said sorry in the way that people say it when they mean it and also know it's not enough and they're saying it anyway. I asked him about Mitchell. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that I've thought about many times since. He said, "We found out about 2 years ago that most of it wasn't real." "What do you mean?" He said that a neighbor of Mitchell's, a woman who'd lived in the building for years, someone who'd become friendly with them when they'd visited, had mentioned, offhandedly, that she'd always thought it was strange, Mitchell calling with emergencies on weekends and then being perfectly fine by Monday, that she'd seen him a number of times, on the evenings of his supposed crises, out on his balcony or leaving to get dinner. Nothing dramatic, just normal life. My father said he and my mother had sat with that for a while, that they'd thought about it, and then they'd brought it up to Mitchell, gently, and Mitchell had not right away, but eventually, in one of the sessions with the counselor, admitted that most of it had been deliberate. I said most. My father said, that's the word he used. I let that sit. Most of it, years of canceled birthdays, an empty chair on graduation day, my father's voice at 7 in the morning on my wedding day, most of it had been deliberate. I asked how Mitchell was doing. My father said better, genuinely. That the therapy had been real work, not a shortcut, and that Mitchell had said things to them, and to the counselor, that had been painful to hear but necessary. Had asked if I would ever be willing to talk. I said I didn't know yet. My father said, "That's fair. We have talked, Mitchell and I, since then. Twice. Both times were uncomfortable and both times felt like something." He didn't try to minimize what he'd done. He said he thought he'd felt invisible when we were growing up and that he'd found something that worked, a way to pull our parents' attention toward him, and that he'd never really stopped to think about what it cost me. He said he'd thought about it now. He said he was sorry. I didn't hug him or tell him we were fine or say some movie ending thing about how we'd start fresh. I said I heard him. And I said that for right now, that was what I had. I talk to my parents regularly now. My mother came to visit last spring and spent 4 days here, and she and Maya became immediately inseparable in the way that grandmothers and 4-year-olds sometimes do, like they share a frequency the rest of us can't quite reach. My father came out for 4th of July and helped me build a raised garden bed in the backyard, and we talked for 3 hours while we worked, and almost none of it was about what had happened between us. That felt significant somehow. The ability to talk about other things. There are still moments, holidays, where something in the room is slightly off, like a picture frame a half-inch crooked that you keep noticing even though you don't want to. There are conversations my parents and I will not have cleanly, maybe ever. There are years I didn't get back. My graduation morning with Bryce at IHOP, my wedding morning in the hotel bathroom looking at my own face. Those things are real and they don't unhappen, but I will tell you what else is real. Last November, my parents drove up for Maya's 4th birthday. We had the kind of party that 4-year-olds require, which is to say it was loud and involved a piñata and too much sugar and a very patient beagle who spent the whole afternoon being chased by small children and bore it with dignity. My mother sat in the middle of it with Maya on her lap, reading her a book she'd brought, some picture book about a bear who keeps misplacing his favorite hat, and Maya kept asking her to do the voice differently, and my mother kept doing it differently 7, 8, 9 times, without once seeming tired of it. My father stood next to me at the back of the yard, watching this, and he said, "She's something." I said, "She really is." We didn't say anything else for a minute. And then my father said, quietly, like he was saying it to the yard more than to me, "I'm sorry I missed the years before this." I looked at him for a moment, and then I said, "I know, because I did. And because sometimes that's the whole thing, knowing someone means it. Even if the meaning comes late. Even if the years before this are still sitting somewhere in a notes app on a phone you don't use anymore. Dated and specific, the record of everything that was lost. You don't get those years back, but you get the ones in front of you if you decide to take them. I decided to take them.